Hello and welcome to this week's edition of ZuCruEdu. My name is Alex and I'm here this week to talk to you about everyone's favorite department at the zoo, the reptile department. So let's start off by meeting the team. First off, there's myself. My name is Alex, and I came here to help develop this department and move the zoo. We also have Andy. Andy is a fabulous reptile keeper. He's worked in many areas here at this facility, but his passion is about reptiles, and it shows in everything that he does. Together, we are a bit of an unstoppable force of reptile enthusiasm. So be prepared, because if you run into one of us at the zoo, you aren't gonna leave without finding that cold-blooded does not in fact mean cold-hearted. Now it's time to meet the animals. And I know what you're thinking. Is she really going to list every single individual animal that they have in the department? And you know the answer already, and the answer is yes. So we're gonna start out by introducing you to our snakes. We have our Dumeral's boas, that's Dobie and Damien, as well as Presley, who's the male. We also have a sand boa named Sandra. She is one of our Shire residents, and although she is on exhibit, she can be a bit challenging to seek out. We then have our California king snakes, that's Elvis and Hershey, as well as our milk snakes, Happy and Skittles. Next, we have Ace, the Puerto Rican boa. Ace is one of my favorite animals in the department, and he has a very interesting story. He was a wild Puerto Rican boa who made a mistake and ended up on a lumber shipment headed to the United States. So he was brought to us by Fish and Wildlife because he was not able to be relocated back to Puerto Rico since he had sort of slipped through customs, if you will. So we are very excited to have him here, and he's not a species that you see very often in zoos. We also have our beautiful Brazilian rainbow boa, Samba, as well as our two smaller and lesser known Colombian rainbow boas, and that's Diego and Nero. In addition, we have our fabulous ball python, Jack, who's one of our best educational ambassadors. Next, we have some of my favorite snakes in the building, our rat snakes and corn snakes. We've got a western black rat snake, and her name is Lucy. We also have a gray rat snake, which are also known as Midland rat snakes, and that is Inigo. Then we have our beautiful leucocystic corn snake, and her name is Lily. There's also Chuck, and he is a standard corn snake. He's our more colorful individual. Then we have Walker, Texas rat snake. He is a very petite individual. He came to us, like many of our animals, from a private home where they didn't really know how to provide for him. So seeing him now on exhibit, he's one of our most active individuals. He's almost always basking on top of his tree or heading down his log and exploring the enclosure. He's quickly become a fan favorite. Saved the best and biggest of these serpents for last. We've got Magic, our female yellow anaconda. She's around 20 years old, which means that she is well into her golden years, but she doesn't look a day over 12, and we tell her every day. Then we've got Perdido, the red-tailed boa, who is on exhibit with Magic. He's another one of our excellent educational ambassadors. He also has an interesting story. He came to us because he was found wandering around the streets of the city of Perdido. Unfortunately, that means it's likely that he was someone's pet, and he either escaped or he was put outside when they were tired of dealing with him, which unfortunately is a reality of many snakes in the pet trade. So he's very lucky to have been found and to make it here to us, and we're very lucky to have him. Not all about snakes, I promise. We also have quite a few turtles and tortoises in our collection. We've got our itty bitty little mud turtle Jane. She's another one of our Shire inhabitants, and who can blame her, because mud turtles spend the majority of their time hanging out in the silt and mud at the bottom of waterways. Then we've got our sulcata tortoises, which are on exhibit outside. They are the third largest species of tortoise in the world, so those big boys are definitely worth a gander. Then we've got our red-footed tortoises, that's Annabelle, Crimson, and Clover, and you can find them on exhibit in front of our alligator enclosure. We also have our fabulous box turtles. So there's our eastern box turtles, that's Jojo and Delta, as well as our three-toed box turtles, and that's Francesca and Cusco. Last but not least, we have a juvenile gopher tortoise that is cared for by our department. His name is Toby, and you can find him on exhibit in the reptile house. On to our lizards, we've got Emma, the green iguana. We also have Saffron, the very fabulous and feisty bearded dragon, Martin, the Saharan Euromastix, and Sunny, the blue-tongued skink. Then everyone's favorites, I'm sure, we have our two American alligators. We have a juvenile American alligator, and his name is Wayne. You can find him at the Swamp Show exhibit. Then we have probably the most famous animal in the zoo. His name is Chucky. He is estimated to be in his 50s. Chucky came to us in the 1980s as a nuisance alligator. Now, what is a nuisance alligator? Well, it's an alligator that's grown a little too fond and friendly of human interaction. Unfortunately, when people feed animals like alligators in the wild, those animals learn to depend on human interactions. That's what we believe happened with Chucky. He was being fed by someone, and then presumably they stopped feeding him, which is probably how he ended up chasing people onto picnic tables in the state park before he was lucky enough to be relocated to the zoo. As sad as it is true that many nuisance animals cannot be relocated, which means that there are many alligators out there who were not as lucky as Chucky. A reminder that we definitely do not want to be feeding wildlife, because even though we think we're helping at the time, it can have unintended and possibly lethal consequences. Now on to animal husbandry. Now, we face a unique series of challenges as reptile keepers. Reptiles aren't cared for in quite the same way that we care for some of the other species that we have at the zoo, like mammals. Namely, they're housed indoors for the most part. Now, when you have a species that's housed outdoors, they're subject to their environment, to changes from the length of daylight to the weather outside, and those can all be very mentally stimulating and a huge part of how an animal interacts with their day, with their exhibit, with their keepers. When you're dealing with indoor exhibits, you're creating microclimates. So they have to be specific to the species that we're creating them for. And we do house a variety of species from all around the world. So we may need something that's dry and warm with a nice humid, cool area for an animal to move to, for animals that come from the desert. Or we might need something that is very humid and very warm with a lot of climbing space for animals that come from more tropical regions. In addition, we have to remember that we control all aspects of that environment. So they don't have weather if we don't give them weather. And we'll get a little bit more into that when we get into our enrichment and how we face those challenges in the reptile department. But quickly, I'd like to also address that we want our exhibits in the reptile house to teach guests something. When you come and you look at a rat snake exhibit, I want you to not only find the animal and read the sign and learn about them, but I want you to be able to see their enclosure as a piece of that ecosystem and learn about those animals' needs, where you might find them in the wild, just by assessing the exhibit overall. So not only is it to meet the animal's needs, I want it to meet your needs and teach you about that reptile as well. And that's something that we try to do with larger exhibits, but certainly occurs on a more exquisite scale when you're dealing with smaller indoor microclimates. Cool. Now, enrichment is another challenging aspect of reptile keeping. For a long time, people didn't really think that reptiles needed as much mental stimulation as their mammalian counterparts here at the zoo, and I happen to firmly disagree. So remember when we were discussing our husbandry and the type of exhibits and enclosures we have, we talked about controlling the entire environment, from the length of daylight to giving them weather. Now, weather is a very mentally stimulating thing, so we can use different sorts of enrichment. So let's say instead of a puzzle ball or puzzle feeder, we can provide a thunderstorm, right? Or a shortened day cycle, things that change for that animal. We can also use a lot of their senses. So many of our reptiles have Jacobson organs. Essentially, it means that they're collecting little particles on their tongue. They have a hyper sense of awareness, using this sense that a lot of other species don't have, to take in their environment. So I could take, let's say, a previously frozen thawed mouse or chick and rub it in the exhibit while the animal's out of the enclosure, and then put that animal back on exhibit, and that will encourage a lot of natural behaviors by stimulating that sense for them. So they're going to be able to pick up on that smell in a way that a lot of other species would not be able to, and it's going to elicit a particular response from them. So enrichment can look a little different when we're dealing with reptiles, but it's still extremely important. I would argue that it might be even more important than it is with some other species. Now, why would I say that it's more important for reptiles? Well, that's because reptiles are ectothermic. That's a fancy way of saying that they are cold-blooded. What does cold-blooded mean? We use that term a lot, and when hard-pressed, most people don't actually know what that means. It means that they don't create their own body heat. They have to depend on outside resources, like the temperature around them, to warm their bodies up enough to be able to function. We're endothermic. That means we are warm-blooded. That's just a way of saying that we produce our heat from within. Well, why does that make reptiles really different when it comes to reptile keeping versus mammal keeping? They're not burning calories unless they're moving around. They're all about conserving energy all the time. So if we give them a perfect spring day with no competition, with no need to go looking for food, it's like setting someone up with the world's greatest Netflix and Disney Plus subscriptions, unlimited DoorDash, and adjustable chair. They may be comfortable and safe and mentally stimulated, and they might be getting the nutrition that they need, but they're still gonna end up overweight and with bed sores. And that is our challenge when we're dealing with ectotherms within a zoo environment, that if we make things too perfect, they are gonna get a little lazy on us, and they're not gonna develop the musculature that they need to be healthy and to live long, healthy lives. So enrichment can be the best ways that we encourage movement and building of musculature for these animals that are a little more prone to taking it easy if allowed. Now, we can't talk about reptiles in zoos without talking about reptiles in the pet trade. Now, unfortunately, there have been a lot of problems with reptiles in the pet trade, and a lot of our individuals within our zoo's collection are confiscations or surrenders from people who got into this thinking that they knew what they were doing, but realized that they were in over their heads. So that means animals like Perdido, our red-tailed boa, Walker, the Texas rat snake that I mentioned earlier, and several of our tortoises and turtles have medical issues or shell deformations that came from being cared for improperly before they arrived here with us. A lot of people don't do the research necessary before ending up bringing their cold-blooded friend home. And believe me, I understand the draw of having one of these animals as a pet. And I'm not saying that all reptiles make bad pets. I am saying, however, that they require a lot more than people realize. We've talked a lot about the challenges of husbandry and enrichment for the zoo's reptiles. And remember that a lot of those species are commonly found in the pet trade. Even sulcata tortoises, the African spurred tortoises that I mentioned before, the third largest species of tortoise in the world, they're often sold as very petite juveniles, and people really don't know what they're getting into. So it's all about researching, making sure that you have a place for those animals, making sure you're gonna have the proper housing and lighting, which can get a little bit expensive, making sure you have the proper food for them, a proper reptile vet, because most vets that see cats and dogs don't really know what they're dealing with. If you bring them a snake with some sort of a medical issue or a turtle with a bubbly nose, they require different types of care. So that's also very important. When people don't do this research and they end up putting these animals outside when they're done with them or trying to donate them to a zoo, oftentimes the zoos don't have room for them, and oftentimes they end up not surviving in the wild, or possibly worse, creating an invasive population in the wild. We live in the southeastern United States, so the climate here is very suitable for many of the reptiles that are commonly found in the pet trade. If you get an animal like a Burmese python when it's a juvenile and it seems like a handleable amount of snake, and it starts to grow up and you put it outside, not only does it have a chance of not surviving, but it has a chance of really being detrimental to the ecosystem that you've now placed this animal that doesn't belong into. We're seeing major issues with this across a lot of the southeastern United States, including in the Everglades, which is one of the most important, unique, and biodiverse ecosystems in the world. Now, most people wouldn't even consider having a reptile as a pet. In fact, a lot of people don't even want them as their neighbors. So I'd like to talk a little bit about why we want to have our cold-blooded cohabitations, why we want these animals and the value of having these animals in our ecosystems. Snakes work for us every day. Yes, that's what I said. Snakes work for us every day. In fact, we would be in big trouble if all snakes disappeared tomorrow. Most of the snakes that live in our area eat rodents. Rodents are a huge problem for humans. They can carry parasites that carry diseases, and they also tend to inhabit our food storage areas and cause major issues with our food supply. So snakes like rat snakes, milk snakes, corn snakes, some of the most common species that people come across are often drawn to areas where we have a lot of food storage. They're drawn to areas where humans are, and it's because they're filling a role in the ecosystem that we've created. We put food there, that drew in rodents, that drew in the snakes to help take care of our rodent problem for us. So if you don't want to do a job in your ecosystem, you should thank the animal that does it for you. I doubt any of us want to spend most of our time trying to take care of a rodent problem, so we should appreciate and thank the snakes that do it for us every day. Now, what should you do if you come across a snake in the wild? We do have several venomous species that are native to this area, and many of our non-venomous species do their best to convince you that they are more dangerous than they actually are, either through behavior, by flattening their heads out, maybe even trying to flatten their body out so it looks more like the shape of a viper, which is the case of many water snakes. They're gonna try to look like a water moccasin by flattening their head out to try to create that triangular shape. Some species that want to convince you that they might be a rattlesnake will also flatten their head and body out, but will also shake their tail and try to convince you from that sound that they're actually more dangerous than they are. Some species, like milk snakes, are born to look like those other species. They depend on their coloration as a natural form of mimicry to allow birds and other animals that might prey on them to be confused enough to leave them alone. Now, when it comes to dealing with humans, we tend to be unsure, and if we're unsure, we don't want it in our space. What you should do if you see a snake is leave it alone. Snakes we want in our area. They do excellent work for us every day, as we've already mentioned. They are not here to hurt you. They're not here to compete with you. They certainly don't want to waste any of that precious energy on you. And even if it is a venomous species, they really don't want to waste that venom on you because, as we've stated, they're all about conservation of energy, and it takes a lot of energy to make venom. In fact, we have some of the most polite species of venomous snake. Rattlesnakes using their rattle, that's not their way of saying, I'm going to bite you. That's their way of saying, please don't make me bite you, I'm afraid. If you hear a rattlesnake before you see one, freeze. Locate where the sound is coming from and then move away from it. If you find yourself in a situation where you can't identify a snake, you're worried that it might be venomous and it's in your home or in your yard, you're afraid that your dog might get to it or that your children might get to it, there's still not a reason to harm that animal. In fact, most snake bites, at least half of the snake bites that occur in the United States every year happen when someone's trying to kill a snake. That means that more than half of the snake bites that occur in this country every year could be avoided entirely if we had just let that animal be. Now, if it has to be relocated, call a trained professional and they will relocate that animal for you. There's no reason for you to try to mess with it in any way, especially if you're not even sure of the species. So we want to remember to have respect for our slithering friends and not just snakes. We want to share spaces with animals like American alligators. We are lucky enough to live in the natural ecosystem and range of one of the coolest apex predators in the northern hemisphere. They are an incredibly resilient species of crocodilian that can venture further from the equator and handle cooler temperatures than any other species of crocodilian in the world. We hunted them to the brink of extinction less than 200 years ago, and thanks to conservation measures, they're now up to more than 1 million individuals in the state of Florida alone. That means that if you live in the Southeast, you are likely sharing space with alligators anytime you enter a natural fresh waterway. So we need to not push them out or fear them, but rather understand them, understand their behavior, where they might be more active. American alligators do not want to make a meal out of you. In fact, their teeth are very blunt. They have a really hard time ripping or shredding things. They will go after prey that is larger than they can swallow whole, but they can't even eat it right away. They would have to cache it. They'd have to take it down underwater and pin it under something like a fallen log so that the water can soften that carcass and they can go back and rip chunks off later. For the most part, they see people and they know that it's not worth the energy output to have a conflict with that person. But when we're going up to alligators, when we're trying to get good photos, when we're creeping up to the side of a bank to get a good shot or to poke them, we are putting ourselves in a position where they are more likely to feel defensive. Now, an alligator, when it's defensive, won't bite you necessarily, but they will flip around and hit you with their tail, and that can also be incredibly dangerous. So the best thing to do is to recognize that we have the honor of sharing our spaces with these incredible animals and to give them the respect and distance that they deserve. They are also playing a very cool role. They're creating spaces that other animals use, and they are taking care of a lot of our ecosystems as the apex predator. They signify the health of our ecosystems as the apex predator. We want to have them around and we want to respect them. We don't want to fear them unnecessarily, and we certainly don't want to bother them. Now, if there's one thing that I want you to take away from this, it is that knowledge is the enemy of fear. The more you know about the local species around you, the less you need to be afraid of them. And let's face it, the zoo is a really excellent place to start. So you should slither on down to the reptile house to learn more about our ectothermic friends.